Hey guys, tonight we aren't going to focus on one epic quest or a single titanic battle. Instead, we're going to drift through a much broader and frankly, more unsettling landscape. The everyday reality of being a mortal in a world run by the Greek gods. Imagine looking down from the highest, cloud-wreathed peak of Mount Olympus. You can see the whole of the Aegean sparkling like a crushed sapphire, the green and brown tapestry of the land dotted with the tiny, hopeful lights of human cities. It's beautiful, it's serene, and from up here, it's all just a game board. You probably wouldn't survive this, not because you'd fail some heroic quest, but because you might accidentally use a river a god was fond of, or be a little too proud of the tapestry you wove. The divine justice system was, to put it mildly, non-existent. So, before you settle into comfort, if stories like this bring you a sense of peace, please consider a gentle tap on the like and subscribe buttons. There's no obligation, of course, but it truly helps our late-night journeys find more fellow travelers. I'd also love to see where you're listening from tonight, so feel free to post your city or country and the local time in the comments. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now, let the outside world fade away. Dim the lights down low. Let the soft white noise of a fan carry you. Take a deep breath and step with me into tonight's story. We're starting with the fundamental problem of being human in ancient Greece, the one that underpins all the others. You were living on a cosmic chessboard, and you were not the king, or the queen, or even a knight. You were a pawn, a disposable piece in a game of unimaginable scale, played by beings who were immortal, impassably powerful, and very, very easily bored. The gods of Olympus are often portrayed as these grand, statuesque figures, chiseled from marble and morality. But it's more useful, and certainly more accurate, to think of them as a dysfunctional family of celebrities living in the universe's most exclusive gated community. They were eternal beings, their veins flowing not with blood, but with a golden, ethereal fluid called ichor. This is a well-known mythological fact, but the implications are what truly matter. Ichor meant they could be wounded, sure, but they couldn't truly die. It set them apart, creating an unbridgeable chasm between their existence and ours. While humanity toiled, aged, and faded, the gods feasted, squabbled, and simply endured. An eternity, it seems, is dreadfully dull. When you have seen 1,000 suns rise, when you have outlasted empires and seen mountains grind to dust, you begin to crave novelty. You crave drama, and mortals were the universe's greatest reality show. We were passionate, flawed, and beautifully fragile. Our lives were tiny, brilliant sparks in the endless dark, and the gods loved to watch the fireworks. They would lean over the balconies of Olympus, sipping nectar and nibbling on ambrosia, and watch our little struggles with the detached amusement of a child watching an ant farm. They would pick favorites, make wagers, and, most terrifyingly of all, decide to intervene. Now, this intervention was rarely about grand notions of justice or cosmic balance. It was almost always personal. A modern analogy might be a billionaire who owns a global corporation, but gets inexplicably furious with a single barista who made his coffee wrong one morning. The power imbalance is so vast, so absolute, that the billionaire could, with a few phone calls, ruin their barista's life, their job, their apartment, their reputation, all before his coffee got cold. That is the scale we are talking about. A god's momentary irritation could unravel a mortal's entire existence. This wasn't just limited to the Big 12 Olympians either. The world was teeming with divinity. Every river had its god, every forest its nymphs, every mountain its own spirit. You couldn't walk a mile without potentially trespassing on some minor deity's sacred territory. Lesser-known sources, like the travelogues of Pausanias, or fragments from lost local plays, are filled with cautionary tales about this. A farmer might reroute a small stream to water his crops, only to find his fields blighted, because that stream was the home of a naiad who enjoyed her privacy. A shepherd might rest in a quiet grove, not realizing it was the favorite haunt of a dryad, and be struck with a sudden, inexplicable madness. There was no warning sign, no divine homeowners association you could consult. You simply had to exist with a constant, low-level anxiety that you could, at any moment, accidentally offend a power that could turn you into a spider or a shrub. It's a bit like trying to relax in a home where every single floorboard is a landmine, and the rulebook for where not to step changes daily. Classicists still argue whether these stories were meant to be taken as literal truth or as allegorical warnings. Were people genuinely afraid of river nymphs? Or were these tales a way to personify the unpredictable and often cruel whims of nature itself? A sudden flood that destroys your farm feels personal, like an attack. How much easier is it to comprehend that disaster if you can blame it on an angry river god rather than on the cold, meaningless chaos of the universe? Giving the disaster a face, a personality, and a motive makes the world feel, ironically, a little less scary. It implies there are rules, even if those rules are arbitrary and wildly unfair. But for the average mortal living in that world, this philosophical debate was probably cold comfort. The core of their reality was that they were subject to beings with the emotional maturity of toddlers, who wielded the power of nuclear weapons. Zeus's wandering eye, Hera's jealousy, Poseidon's grudges, Apollo's vanities weren't just character flaws. They were forces of nature that could sweep through the mortal world like a hurricane. The gods didn't see mortals as their children to be protected. They saw us as their property, their entertainment, their play. We were cherished one moment and crushed the next, not out of grand cosmic design, but simply because a god felt a flicker of annoyance, a pang of desire, or worst of all, a moment of profound, eternal boredom. This understanding is the key. Before we can talk about the heroes, the monsters, and the epic curses, we have to first accept this foundational truth. To be immortal was to be a pawn, and as we're about to see, one of the most dangerous things that could happen to a pawn is to suddenly catch the eye of one of the players, especially if they decided they wanted you for their own. So you've survived another day on the cosmic chessboard we spoke of, carefully navigating the world, trying not to step on any divine toes. You've offered the right sacrifices, you've respected the quiet groves, and you've kept your head down. But then the worst possible thing happens. One of the players, leaning over the board from on high, doesn't just see you as a generic pawn. It sees you, and it decides it wants you. In our modern stories, this is the moment of romance, the fairy tale encounter. But in the Greek world, when a god's gaze fell upon you with desire, it was not the beginning of a love story. It was the beginning of an ownership dispute, and your life was the territory being claimed. The concept of consent in these encounters is, to be generous, entirely absent. A god, particularly an Olympian like Zeus, did not fall in love in the human sense. He was a being of absolute power who saw something he found beautiful and simply decided it was his. The mortal's feelings on the matter were an irrelevant footnote. This divine affection wasn't a partnership, it was an acquisition, often carried out with terrifying deception. Zeus was the undisputed master of this, rarely appearing as himself. To get to his chosen mortal, he would become a shower of gold, a bull, a swan, a flame of fire. You wouldn't even know you were in the presence of a god until it was far, far too late. Let's take the story of Io, a priestess of Hera. She was, by all accounts, living a good and pious life. But she was beautiful, and one day, Zeus noticed. He didn't send her poetry or try to win her heart. He covered the land in a thick, unnatural fog to hide his actions from his ever-watchful wife, Hera, and took what he wanted. Now, this is where the mortal woman finds herself in the ultimate cosmic trap. Io has just been assaulted by the king of the gods, but her immediate problem isn't Zeus, it's Hera, the queen of the gods, whose divine portfolio was basically marriage and jealousy, descends from senses her husband's treachery, and dispels the fog. To hide his crime, Zeus performs a quick, desperate act of transformation. When the mist clears, Hera doesn't find her husband with another woman. She finds him standing next to a beautiful, perfectly white cow, a cow that just happens to have the terrified, weeping eyes of her own priestess, Io. Hera, of course, was nobody's fool. She knew exactly what she was looking at. With a bit of celestial sarcasm, she praised the cow's beauty and asked Zeus for it as a gift. What could he do? To refuse would be to admit his guilt. So he handed over the cow that was Io, condemning her to a living nightmare. This is the mainstream, well-known version of the myth, but it's the details of Io's suffering that truly illustrate the horror. Hera placed Io, in her bovine form, under the guard of Argus, a giant with 100 eyes all over his body, so that he could watch her constantly. Io was tethered, forced to eat bitter grass and drink from muddy streams. She had her human mind, her memories, her grief, but she could not speak. She was trapped inside a beast, dehumanized completely. When she saw her own father, she tried to tell him what happened, but all that came out was a mournful moo. She had to scrape her name Io into the dirt with her hoof just to be recognized. This wasn't just a punishment for Zeus's infidelity, it was a brutal and systematic destruction of a mortal's identity. And even when Hermes eventually killed the 100-eyed Argus, freeing her, Hera's vengeance wasn't over. She sent a vicious gadfly to torment the poor cow, stinging her relentlessly and driving her into a maddened flight across the entire known world. Io wandered for years, from Greece to Asia, in constant agony, a prisoner in her own skin, all because a god desired her for a fleeting moment. And Zeus's behavior wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. But it wasn't just the king of the gods. Other divinities had the same sense of entitlement. A lesser-known, but equally telling story is that of Erythea, a princess of Athens, who caught the eye of Boreas, the god of the north wind. He wasn't some suave Olympian in a toga, he was a raw, elemental force. He tried to woo her, but when that failed, he simply reverted to his nature. He became a tempest, a howling gale that swept down from the mountains, wrapped Erythea in a cloud, and simply carried her away to be his bride. There was no discussion, no choice. One minute, you're a princess walking by a river. The next, you are the unwilling property of a blizzard. It's a chilling reminder that in this world, even the weather could decide it owned you. Classicists still argue whether these myths were simply expressions of a deeply patriarchal society, powerful men, or gods, taking what they wanted, or if they served a more complex social function. Many prominent ancient families claimed divine ancestry to legitimize their rule. Having Zeus or Poseidon in your family tree was the ultimate status symbol, and these stories, violent as they are, provided the narrative backbone for those claims. Perhaps there were also cautionary tales, grim warnings passed from mother to daughter about the very real dangers of attracting the attention of powerful men, whose desires could ruin a woman's life with the same casual force as a god's. From the mortal's perspective, it was a no-win scenario. If you were noticed by a god, you were doomed. If you were noticed by a goddess, you were doomed. And if you were noticed by a god, you were then definitely noticed by his jealous wife, which was often the worst fate of all. Hera's vengeance was legendary, a force of nature in itself. She was the celestial detective, tirelessly hunting down not just her husband's lovers, but also the children born from those unions. Her fury was the engine behind some of the greatest tragedies in Greek myth. To be the object of a god's affection was to have a target painted on your back, visible from Olympus. It wasn't a blessing, it was a curse that would follow you and your children for generations. Your life was no longer your own story. It was now just a messy, tragic chapter in theirs. It seems, then, that keeping your head down and trying to remain unnoticed was the safest path for a mortal. If you could avoid being so beautiful that a god decided to acquire you, as we saw with the tormented Io, you might just have a chance at a peaceful life. It was the act of looking at the cosmic chessboard and not just seeing your place as a pawn, but believing your little wooden head held more wisdom than the immortal player moving the pieces. She was blessed with a large family, 7 strong sons and 7 beautiful daughters. She was proud, and in a moment of fatal arrogance, she stood before the people and boasted that she was more worthy of worship than the goddess Leto, who had only 2 children. The problem was, Leto's 2 children were Apollo and Artemis. When word of this insult reached them, their response was swift and terrible. Apollo, the archer god, descended and shot down all 7 of Niobe's sons with his silver bow. As Niobe wept, cradling her dead sons, her daughters gathered around her to comfort her. But her hubris was not yet fully paid for. Artemis, the archer goddess, then appeared and shot down all 7 daughters. Niobe, rendered speechless by a grief so immense it was inhuman, was transformed into a weeping rock, a permanent, desolate monument to the price of a proud word. This was a violation of the fundamental order of the universe. To the gods, it was the ultimate insult. Remember, these are the same beings from Section 1, the eternally powerful but deeply insecure deities lounging on Olympus. Their immortality didn't necessarily grant them wisdom or maturity. In many ways, it made them more fragile. A mortal who could, even in one tiny area, surpass them was a terrifying thought. It challenged their supremacy, and they would stamp it out with ruthless, overwhelming force. But there was another, equally dangerous way to draw the gaze of Olympus. It wasn't about your face or your form, it was about your talent. In the world of the Greeks, being good at something was a gift, but being too good at something, and worse, being proud of it, was a sin. This was the trap of hubris, a concept we often translate simply as pride, but which was far more specific and far more perilous. Hubris wasn't just arrogance it was the specific, fatal pride that led a mortal to compare themselves favorably to a god. The fields of art and skill were particularly dangerous territories. Take music, for instance. The god Apollo, with his golden lyre, was the master musician of the cosmos. To challenge him was utter folly. Yet, a satyr named Marsyas, a creature of the forests, who had found a flute discarded by the goddess Athena, became so proficient with it that he dared to challenge Apollo to a contest. The Muses were the judges. Marsyas played, and his music was said to be so beautiful, so full of the wild, untamed spirit of the earth, that the birds and beasts fell silent to listen. But then Apollo played his lyre, and his music was the sound of cosmic harmony, of the sun rising, of order and light. He was, of course, declared the victor. But for Apollo, winning wasn't enough. The hubris of the challenge had to be punished. He had Marsyas strung up from a pine tree and flayed alive, a brutal and horrifying end for a creature whose only real crime was making beautiful music. This pattern repeats itself with a chilling regularity. Consider Niobe, a queen of Thebes. She was blessed with a large family, 7 strong sons, and 7 beautiful daughters. She was proud, and in a moment of fatal arrogance, she stood before the people and boasted that she was more worthy of worship than the goddess Leto, who had only 2 children. The problem was, Leto's 2 children were Apollo and Artemis. When word of this insult reached them, their response was swift and terrible. Apollo, the archer god, descended and shot down all 7 of Niobe's sons with his silver bow. As Niobe wept, cradling her dead sons, her daughters gathered around her to comfort her, but her hubris was not yet fully paid for. Artemis, the archer goddess, then appeared and shot down all 7 daughters. Niobe, rendered speechless by a grief so immense it was inhuman, was transformed into a weeping rock, a permanent, desolate monument to the price of a proud word. And this divine jealousy wasn't just limited to the big names like Apollo. The story of Tamiris, a mortal musician from Thrace, provides an even more obscure and chilling example, and keep mortals in a state of fear and reverence awe, if they served a more practical, social purpose. In a highly stratified society, stories that warn against excessive ambition are incredibly useful for maintaining the status quo. They are a way of telling people to know their place, to not challenge authority, whether that authority is a king, a nobleman, or a god. These tales reinforce a conservative worldview. Innovation is dangerous, pride is fatal, and humility is survival. It's a divine version of the proverb, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down." He was a master of the lyre, a poet, and a singer of incredible skill, but his talent fed his pride, and he boasted that he could best the very muses themselves, the 9 goddesses of inspiration, who were the source of all art and science. The muses accepted his challenge. The details of the contest are lost, but the outcome was not. For his audacity, they didn't just defeat him, they inflicted a punishment of exquisite cruelty, perfectly tailored to his crime. They took away his gift, they blinded him so he could no longer see beauty to write about, and they crippled his hands so he could no longer play his lyre, and they destroyed his voice so he could no longer sing. He was left a hollowed-out shell, a living reminder that the gods give talent, and the gods can, with terrifying precision, take it away. Classicists still argue whether these myths about hubris were primarily religious and blunt tool to enforce piety. So, you, the mortal, are trapped. You are told to strive, to be the best you can be, to honor the gods with your works. But a hidden line exists, a line that is invisible until you cross it. You can be a good weaver, but you cannot be a perfect weaver. You can be a fine musician, but not a divine one. You exist in a state of constant, careful modulation, trying to be good enough to prosper, but not so good that you become a threat. The gods, it seems, were the universe's most insecure bosses, happy to take credit for your work until the moment your work started to outshine their own. And nowhere was this fragile, dangerous dynamic more apparent than in the humble art of weaving, with a young woman in a small town whose hands were just a little too gifted with a needle and thread. She was about to learn firsthand what happens when your talent doesn't just earn you praise, but earns you the focused, jealous attention of a goddess. Her name was Arachne, We now arrive at the story of Arachne, the young woman I mentioned, whose name has become synonymous with spiders. Her tale is perhaps the ultimate fable of hubris, a quiet, domestic tragedy that spirals into body horror, all because she was too good with a needle and thread. Remember the brutal, overt punishments meted out to Marsyas and Niobe from the last section? Arachne's fate is somehow more insidious, a testament to the terrifying creativity of a slighted goddess. She wasn't a queen or a hero. She was a girl from a small town in Lydia, a region famous for its rich purple dyes. Her father was a humble wool dyer, his hands perpetually stained with the colors of murex shells. Arachne grew up surrounded by the tools of the trade, the scent of wet wool and expensive pigments, the clatter of the loom a constant rhythm in her home, and she was a prodigy. Her skill at weaving was not just masterful, it was magical. Ovid, who tells her story in the most famous detail, says that the nymphs themselves would abandon their streams and the dryads their forests just to watch her work. They would watch her carding the raw wool, her fingers seeming to dance as they drew it into soft, fine threads. They would watch her at the loom, her shuttle flying with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for mortal hands. The images she created were so lifelike they seemed to breathe. You could almost feel the spray from the oceans she wove, smelled the blossoms in her cloth gardens. Her art was perfect. Herein lies the seed of her downfall. People would look at her work and say, with reverence, "Surely Pallas Athena herself taught you." Athena was the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and She was the divine patron of weavers, the source of all skill in the art. To suggest Arachne was her student was the highest possible compliment. But Arachne, full of the fierce pride of a young, self-made artist, would scoff. "She taught me nothing," she would declare, her voice sharp with defiance. "My skill is my own. Let her come and compete with me. If I lose, I will accept any punishment she deems fit." Word of this challenge, this unbelievable hubris from a low-born girl in Lydia, reached Athena, being the goddess of strategy, decided to give the mortal a final chance to repent. She cloaked herself in the form of a stooped, grey-haired old woman, leaning heavily on a staff, and hobbled into Arachne's workshop. With the feigned wisdom of old age, she gently advised the girl, "Seek all the fame you want among mortals for your craft," the disguised goddess croaked, "but yield to the goddess. Ask her forgiveness for your rash words, and she, in her mercy, will grant it." Arachne looked up from her loom, her eyes flashing with irritation at this unsolicited advice. She told the old woman she had no need of her counsel and insulted her for her age. "If the goddess is so great," Arachne spat, "why does she not come herself and face me?" That was the last line she would cross. "She has come." A voice like a bronze bell echoed through the room. The bent old woman shimmered and grew, her disguise melting away to reveal the tall and terrifyingly serene form of Pallas Athena, clad in armor, her spear in hand. The nymphs, who were watching, paled and bowed in reverence. Only Arachne stood her ground, a flush of defiant excitement on her face. Her wish had been granted. The contest was on. 2 looms were set up, and the divine and the mortal began to weave. Athena's tapestry was a masterwork of divine propaganda. In the center, she wove the scene of her own contest with Poseidon for control of the city of Athens, a majestic and orderly scene. And in the 4 corners, she wove small, clear warnings, 4 different stories of mortals who had dared to challenge the gods, and had been met with ruinous transformation. It was a threat rendered in perfect, golden thread, a final, silent chance for Arachne to see the folly of her pride. This was a reflection of Athena's real-world role. Her followers in Athens, a group of women known as the would weave a massive, intricate robe called the peplis for her statue during a great festival depicting scenes of divine triumph. Athena's tapestry was a personal version of this sacred public work. But Arachne did not heed the warning. Her tapestry was, in its own way, a prayer in reverse. It was with breathtaking skill that even Athena had to admire. Arachne wove a stunning catalogue of the gods' crimes and deceptions against mortals, particularly the very women she was told to revere. There was Zeus, disguised as a bull, carrying off a terrified Europa. There he was again, as a swan, deceiving Leda, and as a shower of gold, tricking Danae. She wove Apollo, Poseidon, Dionysus, more than a dozen scenes of divine abuse, of gods using their power to trick, assault, and ruin mortals. It was a tapestry of breathtaking beauty and blistering truth. Classicists still argue whether Ovid, writing under the often tyrannical rule of the Roman Empire, was using Arachne's tapestry as a form of shielded political commentary. By having a mortal weaver expose the crimes of the gods, he could subtly critique the very real abuses of power he saw in his own world, using the safety of ancient myth as his cover. Arachne's loom became a voice for the powerless against the absolute authority of both gods and empires. When the work was done, Athena stepped forward to judge. She examined Arachne's tapestry, her face a mask of cold fury. She searched for a flaw, a single misplaced thread, a lapse in technique, but could find none. The work was perfect, the artistry was undeniable, and the message, the catalogue of her father Zeus's sins, was an insult that could not be borne. It was the truth of it, so exquisitely rendered. That was the final transgression. In a fit of divine rage, Athena tore the magnificent tapestry to shreds and struck Arachne on the forehead with her shuttle. The blow, for Arachne, shattered not just her body, but her spirit. The humiliation, the sudden, terrifying realization of her folly, was too much. She fled, and in her despair, she tied a noose and attempted to end her own life. But Athena was not finished with her. In a final, twisted act of what the goddess might have considered mercy, she stopped Arachne from dying. "Live," the goddess commanded, "but hang, wicked girl, and know this doom is set for all your race." As she spoke, she sprinkled Arachne with the juices of Hecate's herbs. The girl's body began to horrifically warp and shrink. Her hair fell out, her nose and ears vanished, her head shriveled. Her fingers, those same fingers that wove such wonders, grew long, thin, and spindly, becoming legs. Her body became a small, dark, bloated abdomen. She was no longer a woman, but a spider. Her great talent was not taken away, but perverted into a monstrous, mindless compulsion. She was doomed to hang and weave for all eternity, a tiny, skittering monument to the danger of being too good. Arachne's fate, a horror of twisted limbs and eternal, mindless weaving, serves as a stark warning about the sin of deliberate pride. She picked a fight with a goddess and paid a terrible price. So the lesson seems simple. Don't challenge the gods. Stay humble. But what if you weren't proud? What if you made no challenge, uttered no boast, and held nothing but proper reverence in your heart? What if you were just ... unlucky? This is where we drift into a new, and perhaps more terrifying, realm of mortal peril, the accidental trespass. You could be minding your own business, taking a walk, or going for a hunt, and one wrong turn, one unlucky glance, could seal your doom as surely as any book. The gods, for all their cosmic power and public drama on the world stage, were intensely private beings. The wild places of the earth, the secluded forest groves, the hidden springs, the remote mountain caves were their sanctuaries, their backstage dressing rooms. When a mortal stumbled into one of these places at the wrong moment, they weren't seen as a lost traveler in need of directions. They were seen as an intruder, a peeping Tom, a violator of a sacred boundary. It's like accidentally walking into the private office of a famously mercurial CEO. The apology often comes too late, and the single most dangerous thing a mortal could accidentally do was to see a deity in a state of undress. This wasn't about simple mortal modesty. Seeing a god in their raw, unveiled form was considered an affront, a sight that the mortal mind and soul were not equipped to handle. The divine form in its pure state was a source of power so immense that to witness it was to be irrevocably changed, and usually for the worse. The famous blind seer Tiresias is a prime example of this. In one version of his myth, as a young man, he was hunting in the woods and happened upon a spring where Athena and her companion, the nymph Chariclo, were bathing. He didn't mean to be there. He was just thirsty, but he saw the goddess unveiled. Athena's reaction is fascinating because it contains a sliver of something almost like regret, filtered through divine superiority. She placed her hands over his eyes, and he was plunged into permanent darkness. His mother, the nymph Chariclo, was horrified and berated the goddess for blinding her son. But Athena's response was chillingly calm. She explained that it was not she who blinded him, but the ancient laws of the cosmos. The law stated, any mortal who sees an immortal against their will must lose their sight. She could not undo the act. It was a fundamental rule of reality. As a form of compensation for the life she had just ruined, she granted Tiresias the gift of prophecy, the ability to understand the speech of birds, and a staff that would guide his now sightless steps. He went on to become the most famous oracle in all of Greek myth, but he was still a man who paid for an accidental glance with the light of the world. He was one of the lucky ones. This idea of unintentional offense extended beyond just sight. The natural world was riddled with invisible tripwires. The god Pan, the half-goat lord of the wilds, was a generally jovial figure, but he was known to take a nap in the heat of the afternoon. A very specific superstition, a quirky but serious tidbit from Greek folklore, was that it was incredibly dangerous to make noise in the countryside at midday. You could be a shepherd playing your pipes, a traveler singing on the road, and if your noise disturbed the sleeping Pan, his wrath was instantaneous and terrifying. He wouldn't just appear and scold you, he would inflict panic and daima, panic fear, a sudden, irrational, mind-breaking terror that would send men and flocks scattering in madness. The very word panic comes from this deeply held fear of accidentally waking a grumpy god from his nap. Cliffhanger still argue whether these stories of accidental trespass were created by the very real fears of the natural world, or if the stories themselves created the fear. Is the myth of Pan's anger a way to explain the sudden, unnerving silence that can fall over a forest at noon, or the primal fear you feel when you are alone in a vast, untamed landscape? Or did the story come first, populating that landscape with invisible, irritable forces that must be constantly appeased? It's a bit of a chicken and egg debate, but it points to a fundamental human need to impose a narrative, a set of rules and personalities onto the dangerous chaos of nature. A sudden rock slide is a random tragedy. A rock slide caused by an angry mountain spirit you offended is a lesson you can, hopefully, teach your children to avoid. So the average mortal had to navigate not only the whims of the great Olympians, but also a dense minefield of local taboos. Don't disturb this spring. Don't chop wood from that grove. Don't sing too loudly at noon. The world was sacred, and you're profane. Mortal existence was a constant source of potential disruption. You were living in a divine nature preserve where you were both the main attraction and the most likely source of pollution. And while Athena may have shown a cold sort of mercy and Pan's fury might pass, not all deities were so forgiving. The goddess of the hunt, the eternal virgin of the silver bow, was famously protective of her privacy. To stumble upon her was to make the gravest mistake of your short, mortal life. And a young prince from Thebes, a skilled hunter named Actaeon, was about to do just that, leading to a punishment so gruesome it would make blindness seem like a gift. We left off with the unsettling knowledge that a simple, unlucky misstep could bring ruin, while Tiresias received a strange form of compensation for his accidental glance at Athena. Not all gods possessed such a complex, albeit cold, sense of justice. Some were creatures of pure instinct and wrath, and no one learned this lesson more brutally than Actaeon, the young hunter, prince of Thebes. His story is a masterclass in divine overreaction, a chilling descent from a perfect day into the depths of horror, all because he walked through the wrong part of the forest at the wrong time. Imagine Actaeon, at the start of that day. He is everything a young nobleman should be. He is handsome, skilled, a master of the hunt, grandson of the hero Cadmus, who founded his city. He's in his prime, leading his companions on a hunt on the sun-drenched slopes of Mount Cithaeron. The air is warm, the hunt has been a great success, and the nets are heavy with game. Being a responsible leader, Actaeon calls a halt at midday. Our work is done for today, he tells his men. The forest has been good to us. Let us rest and return tomorrow. He is fair, he is prudent. There is no hubris here, no prideful boast. He is simply a man who has done his job well, and now seeks a little peace and quiet, while his men relax. Actaeon decides to wander off, by himself, looking for a cool spring to quench his thirst and wash away the grime of the hunt. He walks deeper into the unfamiliar woods, the sound of his companions fading behind him, replaced by the gentle hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. He comes upon a grotto, a place of profound, almost sacred beauty. A natural arch of rock forms the entrance to a small, secluded cave, where a spring of the clearest water you can imagine pools on the mossy ground. It is a perfect, hidden paradise. It is also the favorite bathing spot of Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt. He parts a curtain of leaves, and his luck runs out. There she is, not in her formidable hunting gear, but as he was never meant to see her, bathing in the cool water with her attendant nymphs. For a moment, there is a frozen tableau of shock. The nymphs, seeing a mortal man, cry out and rush to shield their mistress's body with their own. But it is too late. Actaeon has seen the goddess in her unveiled state. As we established, this is a capital offense in the cosmic rulebook. Artemis's reaction is not one of calculated justice like Athena's. It is one of pure, instantaneous rage. Her bow and arrows are resting on a nearby tree, out of reach. So she does the next best thing. She cups her hands, scoops up water from the pool, the very water that was a symbol of her purity, and flings it into Actaeon's face. As the droplets spatter across his skin, she utters her curse. Now, she snarls, "You may go and boast that you have seen Diana naked, if you can boast at all." The transformation begins immediately, and it is a nightmare experienced from the inside. Actaeon feels a strange weight on his head. He touches his brow, and his fingers meet not skin, but the hard, branching points of antlers. His arms stretch and thin, his hands warping and hardening into hooves. His skin, moments ago that of a sun-bronzed man, coarsens and darkens into a deer's hide. His human mind is still there, screaming in silent horror, but his heart is no longer the heart of a prince. It has been replaced by the frantic, terrified heart of a stag. He turns and catches his reflection in the still water of the pool, and a wave of pure terror washes over him. He is a monster. He is prey. He flees, crashing through the undergrowth, the new, strange grace of a deer feeling alien to him. And then, he hears it, a sound that once brought him joy, the excited baying of hunting dogs. His hunting dogs, the pack he had raised from pups, the companions he loved. Ancient writers like Ovid and Hyginus took the time to list the names of these dogs, a quirky and horrifying detail that makes the betrayal so much more personal. There was Melampus, the Blackfoot, Ichnobates, the Tracker, Agrodis, the Savage too, and dozens more. They catch his scent, the scent of a stag, and the chase is on. Classicists still argue whether the myth of Actaeon is a straightforward cautionary tale about piety, or if it represents the ghost of a much older, darker ritual. Some scholars suggest it's a distorted memory of a pre-Hellenic practice where a king, representing the spirit of the wild, would be ritually sacrificed, perhaps even torn apart, to ensure the fertility and renewal of the land and its animals. The antlers on Actaeon's head, in this view, are not just a punishment but a remnant of a shamanistic or royal costume. Others see it as a more psychological fable about the hunt itself, warning that a hunter who spends too much time in the wild risks losing his own humanity, becoming the very beast that he pursues. But for Actaeon, there is no time for scholarly debate. He can hear his beloved dogs closing in. He tries to scream, "I am Actaeon, your master," but only the bleating cry of a terrified deer comes out. The sound only excites the pack further. They surge around him, a flurry of teeth and claws. He is pulled down, and his life ends in a storm of agony, torn limb from limb by the very creatures he had nurtured and loved. The final, bitter irony comes moments later, when his human companions arrive, following the commotion. They see the magnificent stag brought down by the pack and cheer. They call out for their prince, wishing Actaeon were there to witness such a glorious kill, all while their lost master is dying at their feet. Unrecognized, his trespass was accidental, his character blameless, yet his punishment was absolute, a perfect, horrifying circle of irony, where his identity, his pride, and his closest companions were all weaponized against him. He wasn't just killed, he was erased. And his fate is a chilling reminder that even if you committed no crime yourself, the anger of the gods was so vast, it could easily splash onto those around you. The gruesome end of Actaeon, torn apart by the very hounds he loved, underscores a terrifying reality of divine punishment. It is often perfectly, poetically, and horrifically ironic, but his doom, at least, was his own. He was the one who stumbled into the grotto, and he was the one who paid the price. We now drift into an even more unsettling layer of mortal existence, where the concepts of personal guilt and individual accountability completely dissolve. This is the realm of collateral damage. You could be a model of piety, a paragon of virtue, and live a life completely free of hubris or error. And yet, you could be utterly destroyed simply because you were the friend, the sibling, the child, or even just the neighbor of someone who angered a god. Divine wrath was not a sniper rifle, aimed with precision at a single target. It was a tidal wave, swamping everything and everyone connected to the initial offender. The gods, it seems, were firm believers in collective punishment. An insult from one member of a family was seen as a stain upon the entire lineage, and the gods' response was less a punishment and more of a deep, brutal cleansing of the whole bloodline. We've already touched upon this with the fate of Niobe's 14 children, struck down by Apollo and Artemis for their mother's boastful words. They were guilty of nothing more than being her offspring, yet they were erased from existence. Perhaps one of the most tragic and sprawling examples of this divine splash damage is the fate of the royal house of Thebes, specifically the sisters of Semele. Semele, you may recall, was one of Zeus's mortal lovers, the mother of the god Dionysus. Tricked by a disguised Hera, Semele demanded to see Zeus in his true, divine form, and was instantly incinerated by his glory. You might think her death would be enough to satisfy Hera's jealousy, but you would be wrong. Hera's rage extended to Semele's sister Zeno, Agave, and Autonomy, who she felt had aided the affair, or, perhaps worse, had doubted Semele's divine lover in the first place. Her revenge upon them was not swift, but a slow, psychological dismantling of their entire lives. Take Ino. She and her husband, King Athamas, had taken in the infant Dionysus to raise him after his mother's death. Further infuriating Hera, the goddess descended to the underworld and commanded the Furies to drive the couple mad. Athamos, his mind filled with horrific visions, suddenly saw his wife and 2 sons not as his family, but as a lioness and her cubs. In a fit of insane rage, he snatched his son Lurchus, swung him around, and smashed his head against a stone wall. Ino, screaming in terror, fled with their other son Melicertes in her arms. Pursued by her mad husband, she reached the cliffs overlooking the sea, and the final act of despair, leaped into the churning water below, taking her child with her. A happy, royal family, obliterated because their sister had an affair with the wrong god. Her sister Agave's fate was even more horrific, becoming a cornerstone of one of the most famous Greek tragedies, Euripides' The Bac. Years later, her nephew, the no-grown god Dionysus, returned to Thebes to establish his cult. Agave's son, King Pentheus, refused to recognize Dionysus as a deity and forbade his worship. For this insult, Dionysus decided to make an example of him. He inflicted a Bacchic frenzy upon the women of Thebes, including his own aunts. He then lured Pentheus, disguised as a woman, to spy on their secret rites in the mountains. The maddened women, Agave among them, saw not their king, but a mountain lion. In a divine frenzy, they hunted him down. His own mother was the first to reach him, and in her god-driven madness, she tore off his arm. The rest of the women, his aunts and cousins, descended upon him and ripped him to pieces. The climax of the tragedy is the image of Agave returning to the city in triumph, carrying on the end of her staff what she believes is the head of a lion she has killed. It is, of course, the head of her own son. The slow, dawning horror as the madness fades and she recognizes what she has done is one of the most chilling moments in all of literature. All this because decades earlier, her sister fell in love with Zeus. It wasn't just families. Entire cities could suffer for the sins of their rulers, in a quirky but telling detail found in later texts, like aliens on the characteristics of animals. There existed a belief in what you could call generational curses for specific crimes. It was said that if a man were to rob a temple, not only would he be punished, but the curse would manifest physically in his descendants, who might be born lame, or blind, or otherwise deformed. This is a very literal, almost clinical example of divine anger echoing through time, marking a bloodline for a crime it did not commit. Classicists still argue whether these tales of collective punishment were a primitive form of social control or a reflection of a fundamentally different worldview. One school of thought suggests these myths reinforced the immense importance of a good and pious ruler. If the king sins, the crops fail, the sea monster arrives, the children die. Therefore, the populace has a vested interest in ensuring their leader stays on the right side of the gods. It binds the community together in a shared, fearful obedience. Another view posits that it reflects a pre-individualistic understanding of identity, where the family, clan, or city was seen as a single corporate entity. Your actions were not just your own, they belonged to the group. The Greek concept of miasma, or ritual pollution, fits here. The sin of one person could pollute the entire community. and the god's wrath was not so much a punishment as a violent, necessary purification of that stain. So you, the mortal, are caught in a web you did not spin. You have avoided personal entanglements with the gods. You have kept your pride in check. You have been careful not to trespass, but none of that matters if your father cheats a god out of payment, or your aunt scoffs at a goddess, or your cousin refuses to worship a new deity. You are simply standing in the blast radius, and for the gods, that's close enough to be guilty. It is a profoundly unjust system, but it is the system you must exist in, and it leads to an even more chilling question. What if even that isn't the reason? What if you suffer not because of your own actions, or even the actions of your family, but for no discernible reason at all? We have, so far, tried to establish a kind of grim survival guide for the Greek mythological world. We've learned that you shouldn't be too beautiful, lest a god decide to possess you. You shouldn't be too talented, lest you bruise a divine ego, as Arachne did. You must be careful not to take a wrong turn in the woods and accidentally witness something you weren't meant to see, like the unfortunate Actaeon. And, as we saw with the cursed house of Thebes, you must fervently hope that none of your relatives ever break any of these rules, lest their punishment splash onto you. It's a terrifying and unjust set of rules, but they are, at least, rules. They imply a universe of cause and effect, however lopsided. But now we must enter the deepest, most unsettling circle of this mortal hell. We must confront the possibility that sometimes there is no cause. Sometimes there is no rule broken, no hubris, no trespass, no inherited guilt. Sometimes the gods inflict suffering upon mortals for no other reason than because they can. This is the horror of casual cruelty, of suffering as a spectator sport. It's the final soul-crushing realization that you are not just a pawn on the cosmic chessboard, but a toy in the hands of a bored and capricious child who might break you simply to see what happens. The Trojan War is the grandest, most epic example of this. A decade of slaughter, the death of countless heroes, the razing of one of the world's greatest cities, the enslavement of its people, all of it, at its root, began because three goddesses got into a petty argument over who was the prettiest. The whole bloody affair was kicked off at a wedding, when Eris, the goddess of discord who, in a truly genius move, had not been invited, drawled a golden apple into the party, inscribed with the words "for the fairest." Three goddesses immediately laid claim to it: Hera, the queen; Athena, the warrior scholar; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Zeus wisely refused to judge this impossible contest and passed the buck to a mortal shepherd prince named Paris of Troy. The three goddesses appeared before him and essentially offered bribes. Hera offered him power over all of Asia and Europe. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite, with a sly smile, offered him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world for his wife. Paris, being a young man, made the obvious choice. He gave the apple to Aphrodite, sealing his own fate and the fate of his city. The problem was, the most beautiful woman, Helen, was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. When Paris, with Aphrodite's help, abducted Helen and took her to Troy, the combined armies of Greece sailed to get her back, and the war began. What followed was 10 years of brutal warfare, but for the gods, it was the ultimate entertainment. They picked sides like it was a divine fantasy league. Hera and Athena, still bitter about losing the beauty contest, sided fiercely with the Greeks. Aphrodite and Apollo backed their chosen champion, Paris, and the Trojans. The gods treated the plains of Troy as their personal playground. They would whisper strategies to their favorite heroes, give them supernatural bursts of strength, and sometimes even physically intervene. They would deflect a spear meant for one man, or guide an arrow into the heart of another. The mainstream epics are full of these interventions. In one famous scene, the Greek hero, Diomedes, empowered by Athena, goes on a rampage and actually wounds two gods in one day. He stabs Aphrodite in the wrist, who runs weeping from the battlefield, and later he spears Ares, the god of war himself, who bellows in pain and flees to Olympus to complain to Zeus. Their involvement wasn't about justice, it was about the thrill of the game, and they constantly interfered to make the game more interesting, prolonging the war and multiplying the suffering for their own amusement. And this casual disregard for mortal life wasn't just in the epics. Obscure myths are full of strange, disproportionate punishments for minor slights. Ovid tells the tale of the goddess Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis, who was fleeing Hera's persecution. Exhausted and thirsty, she stopped by a pond in the land of Lythia, hoping for a drink. The local peasants, for no particularly good reason, were cruel to her. They refused her a drink and then waded into the pond, deliberately stirring up the mud with their hands and feet to make the water undrinkable. Leto's response was swift and bizarre. She didn't just strike them down, she cursed them. "May you live in this pond forever." At her words, their bodies warped. They grew wide, green, and warty. Their voices became harsh croaks. They were transformed, for their one act of petty meanness, into the world's first frogs, doomed to live forever in the very mud they had stirred up. A momentary lack of hospitality. Eternity as an amphibian. Classicists still argue whether these myths of motiveless cruelty represent the most terrifying aspect of the Greek worldview, the acknowledgement of a universe that is not just unjust, but fundamentally absurd. If suffering can be inflicted for no reason, as it was upon the millions affected by the Trojan War, then all the rules of piety and caution are ultimately meaningless. You can do everything right and still be destroyed by a whim. These stories function as a kind of mythological grappling with the problem of evil. Much like the Book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, they confront the agonizing question, why do bad things happen to good, or at least, average people? The answer the myths provide is a chilling one, because the beings in charge are not good, they are merely powerful. The life of a mortal was therefore lived in the shadow of this terrible knowledge. You could be undone by desire, pride, accident, or association, but even if you navigated all of those traps, you could still be swept away by a tide of divine cruelty that you did nothing to provoke. It is the most helpless feeling of all. But there is one last cruel twist of the knife in the relationship between gods and men. What happens when a god, instead of trying to harm you, decides to help you? What happens when they offer you a gift? As we are about to see, sometimes the greatest curse of all comes wrapped as a blessing. After drifting through tales of divine wrath, jealousy, and pure unmotivated cruelty, a glimmer of hope might appear on the horizon. What if a god actually liked you? What if, instead of punishing you for an accidental trespass or a relative's bad manners, a deity decided to reward you, to give you a gift? This, surely, must be where the mortal's luck turns around. But in the tragicomedy of Greek myth, this is often the cruelest joke of all. A gift from a god was rarely a simple blessing. It was a cosmic monkey's paw, a wish granted with a little that was either born of breathtaking stupidity or pure, calculated malice. Be careful what you wish for, especially when the one granting the wish sees you as little more than a pet. The most famous cautionary tale on this subject is, of course, that of King Midas of Phrygia. Midas was a decent enough king, though perhaps a little too fond of wealth. One day, the elderly, perpetually inebriated tutor of the god Dionysus, a satyr named Silenus, wandered off from a celebration and was found lost in Midas's kingdom. Midas, recognizing him, treated the satyr with great honor and hospitality for 10 days before returning him safely to his divine student. Dionysus, delighted to have his old teacher back, was overjoyed and told Midas he would grant him any one wish his heart desired. This was Midas's moment, a direct line to divine power. He could have wished for wisdom, for peace, for his kingdom, for a long and happy life. But Midas's heart was filled with the glitter of riches. After a moment's thought, he made his wish that everything he touched would turn to gold. Dionysus, perhaps with a flicker of divine amusement, granted it. At first, it was pure ecstasy. Midas tentatively touched a twig on an oak tree, and it instantly became a solid gold branch. He picked up a stone, and it became a heavy golden nugget in his palm. He walked through his rose garden, his fingers brushing against the blossoms, leaving behind a trail of exquisite, metallic flowers. He was ecstatic, believing he had become the most powerful and wealthy man on earth. He had cracked the code. The horror, as it so often does in these stories, dawned slowly, creeping in at the edges of his joy. He commanded his servants to prepare a magnificent feast to celebrate his new power. He sat down at the table, piled high with roasted meats, fresh bread, and fine wines. He reached for a slice of bread, and the moment his fingers touched it, it became a hard, inedible brick of gold. Thirsty, he raised a goblet of wine, but as it touched his lips, it became a stream of molten, undrinkable metal. The very source of his new wealth was now going to be the cause of his starvation. The panic began to set in. a cold dread seeping through his joy. The true nightmare, however, was yet to come. His beloved daughter, seeing her father's distress, ran to him to offer a comforting embrace. He reached out to hold her, and with a single, loving touch, he transformed his living, breathing child into a cold, silent, golden statue. In that moment of absolute horror, Midas understood the catastrophic nature of his wish. His great gift was a hideous curse. He prayed to Dionysus, begging him to take it back. Dionysus, perhaps taking some pity on the foolish king, told him how to reverse it. He was to travel to the river Pactolus and wash his hands in its waters. Midas did so, and as he washed, the golden power flowed out of him and into the river, leaving its sands forever shimmering with gold. He was free, but he was a changed man, haunted by the memory of his daughter as a statue, and forever wary of the blessings of the gods. This trap of divine literalism wasn't unique to Midas. There is the lesser-known, but equally tragic tale of the Cumaean Sibyl, a priestess of Apollo. The god, desiring her, offered to grant her any wish. She, in a moment of inspiration, scooped up a handful of dust and wished for as many years of life as there were grains of dust in her hand. Apollo granted her wish for a near eternity of life, but she had made a critical omission in her request, a loophole the god was happy to leave open. She had forgotten to ask for eternal youth. Apollo offered to grant her that too, but only in exchange for her love. She refused him, and so she was doomed to live for 1,000 years, her body withering and shrinking with each passing century, until she was nothing more than a tiny, desiccated creature living in a jar. Her prophetic voice, the only thing left of her, a disembodied whisper from a prison of age. Classicists still argue whether these tales are simple morality fables against human greed and foolishness, or if they represent a more profound philosophical argument. Are they just saying don't be greedy like Midas, or are they suggesting that the very nature of human desire is flawed, and that striving for anything beyond our prescribed mortal lot, be it immense wealth or immense life, is an act of hubris destined for ruin? This interpretation suggests a deep pessimism at the heart of the Greek worldview, that true happiness is found not in achieving our desires, but in wanting less. It's a philosophy that preaches contentment with your limitations, because the gods have proven, time and again, that their idea of more is a terrifying thing indeed. A gift from the gods, then, was a test. It was a puzzle box that, if opened incorrectly, would release not a treasure, but a plague. They simply did not have the perspective to understand what made a human life worth living. Their gifts were like giving a child a loaded gun. Their inability to comprehend the consequences made the gesture all the more dangerous. And perhaps the most poignant example of this, the story that most perfectly captures the tragedy of a wish granted all too well, is that of Tithonus, who asked for the one thing all mortals crave, and received it as an eternal curse. We've seen how a gift from a god can be a trap, born of greed in the case of Midas, or foolish pride in the case of the Sibyl. But now we arrive at the most heartbreaking story in this strange category of cursed blessings. This isn't a tale about greed or ambition. It's a story about love, genuine, deep affection between a goddess and a mortal, and how that love, when it tried to defy the fundamental laws of existence, created a horror more pitiable and profound than any punishment. This is the story of Tithonus, the man who was loved by the dawn and was doomed by that love to wither forever. Tithonus was a prince of Troy, brother of the future king Priam. He was, by all accounts, impossibly beautiful, so beautiful that he caught the eye of Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Every morning, it was Eos's duty to open the gates of heaven, her rosy fingers painting the sky with color to announce the coming of her brother, Helios, the sun. Unlike the fleeting, often predatory passions of Zeus, Eos's love for Tithonus was real and all-consuming. She abducted him, as was the divine custom, and took him to her celestial palace at the edge of the ocean. There, they lived in bliss, and she bore him 2 sons. For a time, it was a perfect, if unusual, union, but a shadow loomed over their happiness, the relentless march of time. Eos was immortal, her beauty renewed with every sunrise. Tithonus was a mortal man. The goddess watched him, her heart aching as she imagined the future. She saw his black hair turning to silver, his smooth skin wrinkling, his strong body growing frail. She would remain forever young, while he would age and die, leaving her alone for the rest of eternity. The thought was unbearable, and so, driven by a desperate, powerful love, she went before the throne of Zeus himself to make a plea. With tears in her eyes, she begged the king of the gods to grant her mortal lover a gift, eternal life. Zeus, perhaps moved by her sincerity, or perhaps just weary of these emotional appeals, consented with a nod. Tithonus was now immortal. It would never die. Eos was overjoyed, believing she had saved their love from the cruel blade of time. But in her emotional, focused plea, in her desire to solve the single problem of his death, she had made a catastrophic omission. It was the same fatal error the Sibyl of Cumae had made when she wished for years as numerous as grains of dust. Eos had asked for eternal life, but she had forgotten to ask for eternal youth. For a few golden years, everything was perfect. But then, slowly, the curse began to reveal itself. The first grey hairs appeared at Tithonus's temples. Eos might have plucked them out, a small denial of the inevitable, but more came. Fine lines appeared around his eyes, deepening into wrinkles. His shoulders, once broad and strong, began to stoop. His voice, once rich and commanding, began to thin. He was aging, just as any mortal man would. But for him, the process would never end. He would not find the peace of the grave. He was on a road that had no destination, a decline that had no bottom. The story, most famously told in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, becomes a slow, quiet horror. Eos cared for him, fed him with divine ambrosia, and clothed him in fine robes, but nothing could stop the decay. He grew older, and older, and older still. He became feeble, then bedridden, a shrunken, helpless creature who could not lift his own hand. His mind, once sharp, began to wander, and he would babble endlessly, his thin, reedy voice filling the halls of her palace with meaningless chatter. He was a living mummy, a withered husk animated by an immortal pulse. Eventually, according to some versions of the myth, the sight of him became too much for Eos to bear. He was no longer the beautiful man she had fallen in love with, but a constant, grotesque reminder of her own failure. She locked him away in a solitary chamber, a gilded prison where he could live out his endless dotage in private. All that was left of him was the sound, a constant high-pitched chirping monologue that echoed from behind the closed door. Finally, out of a last shred of pity for the thing he had become, Eos transformed him. She turned him into a cicada. The logic is strangely poetic. The cicada emerges from a long slumber underground, sheds its old withered skin, and sings its high, shrill song endlessly in the heat of the sun. It was a fitting, if melancholy, end for a man who had become nothing but a disembodied, babbling voice, trapped in a body that had long since given up. Classicists still argue whether the myth of Tithonus is primarily a human tragedy about the follies of love, or if it's a more rigid theological statement about the unbridgeable chasm between gods and mortals. Is this a story about Eos's personal mistake, or is it a story that uses her mistake to define the very nature of humanity? This interpretation suggests that our mortality is not a flaw to be corrected, but our single most defining characteristic. The attempt to strip it away, even with the best intentions, doesn't elevate a mortal to a god. It turns him into a monster. The story asserts that the beauty of mortal life is inextricably linked to its brevity, and to try and have one without the other is to create something unnatural and tragic. Tithonus's fate is perhaps the most painful of all, for it was born not of anger or greed, but of love. His eternal suffering was a gift, given with a full heart. It teaches the final, grim lesson about divine intervention. Even their love is poison. Their attempts to help are guided by a perspective so alien that they cannot help but fail. They could grant eternal life, but they could not preserve the things that make life worth living. They could stop death, but they could not stop time. And if even the gods are powerless against the grand, sweeping forces of destiny and decay, what hope could a mortal possibly have? The story of Tithonus, the man beloved by the dawn, leaves us with a profound sense of despair. His fate shows us that even with a god's love and the gift of immortality, the fundamental forces of time and decay are relentless. Even a goddess was powerless to stop her lover from aging. This hints at a power in the Greek cosmos that is even greater than the gods themselves. A force colder, more ancient, and absolutely implacable. This is the power of fate, or Moira, and if the gods themselves are subject to its unwritten laws, what possible hope could a mortal have of escaping their own destiny? This is the folly of prophecy. In the Greek world, your life was not a blank page for you to write on. It was a thread, spun, measured, and ultimately cut by three ancient sisters, the Moirai. They were the embodiment of destiny, and their decisions were final. Often glimpses of this pre-written future were revealed to mortals through oracles, most famously the oracle at Delphi. But receiving a prophecy was not like getting a stock tip, a piece of information you could use to your advantage. It was a death sentence with the date left blank. The knowledge itself became the prison, because any and every action you took to avoid your fate would, perfect, tragic irony, be the very thing that led you directly to it. There is no greater or more harrowing example of this than the story of Oedipus, the doomed king of Thebes. His father, King Laius, received a prophecy from the Delphic oracle that his own son was fated to kill him and marry his wife, Queen Jocasta. To prevent this horrifying outcome, Laius and Jocasta did what they thought was necessary. When their son was born, they pierced his ankles, bound them together, and gave him to a servant to be abandoned on a desolate mountainside, left to die of exposure. This, they believed, was the end of the story. They had averted their fate, but the servant took pity on the infant. Instead of leaving him to die, he gave the baby to a shepherd from the nearby kingdom of Corinth. That shepherd, in turn, presented the child to his own childless king and queen, who adopted the boy and raised him as their own. They named him Oedipus, which means swollen foot, because of the scars left from his bindings. Oedipus grew up believing he was the prince of Corinth, with no knowledge of his true parentage. As a young man, he heard a drunken nobleman at a banquet mutter that he was not the king's real son. Troubled, Oedipus traveled to the same oracle at Delphi to ask the truth. The oracle gave him no clear answer about his parents. Instead, it gave him his own horrifying prophecy. You are fated to kill your father and sleep with your mother. Horrified, believing the king and queen of Corinth were his parents, Oedipus made the only choice he felt he could. He resolved never to return to Corinth, to flee his home and the fate that awaited him there. He turned his back on the city he loved and took the road that led towards Thebes. He was running from his fate, but he was running in a perfect circle. On the road, at a narrow crossroads, he came upon an entourage accompanying an older, haughty nobleman in a chariot. A dispute broke out over who had the right of way. Tempers flared, insults were exchanged, and in a fit of pride and rage, Oedipus killed the nobleman and all but one of his servants. The man he killed was, of course, a stranger to him. He was also his true father, King Laius, on his way to consult the oracle. The first part of the prophecy was now fulfilled. Oedipus continued on to Thebes, a city tormented by the Sphinx. He famously solved her riddle, freeing the city and being hailed as a hero. As a reward, he was offered the throne of the now leaderless city and the hand of its widowed queen Jocasta. He accepted, married her, and went on to rule wisely for many years, having 4 children with the woman who was unknown to him, his own mother. The trap was now fully sprung, a perfect, inescapable machine built from his own choices, his own virtues, his own flight from the very thing he was running towards. A lesser-known but equally powerful example of this oracular irony is the tale of Croesus, the fabulously wealthy king of Lydia. As told by the historian Herodotus, Croesus was contemplating a war with the rising power of Persia. Before committing his troops, he sent messengers to the oracle at Delphi with a simple question: should I attack? The oracle gave him a typically ambiguous answer: if you cross the river and attack the Persians, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus was delighted. He heard what he wanted to hear. Assuming the great empire to be destroyed was Persia, he launched his invasion and was utterly crushed by the Persian forces. As he was about to be executed, he finally understood the oracle's true meaning. The great empire he had destroyed was his own. Classicists still argue whether these myths demonstrate a total lack of free will in the Greek worldview or something more subtle and tragic. Is Oedipus just a puppet, with every action dictated by fate? Or is it that his fate is fixed, but his choices, which he makes freely, are the tools fate uses to achieve its ends? This latter view is somehow more devastating. It suggests that Oedipus's most essential qualities, his intelligence that solves the riddle, his quick temper on the road, his determination to flee Corintha, very things that make him him, are also the gears in the machine of his own destruction. His free will is not an illusion. It is simply the path his destiny forces him to walk. So, for the mortal, The universe is a rigged game. The gods are capricious and cruel, and could ruin your life on a whim. But even above them, the cold, dispassionate machinery of fate grinds on, and no amount of piety, struggle, or cleverness can alter its design. To be told your future was not a gift, but the ultimate curse, a confirmation that your life was not your own. You are an actor in a play whose ending has already been written. Even if you were the star of the show, a great hero, you were still just an instrument, a tool being used for a divine purpose you could never fully understand. We've established that the life of a mortal is governed by a script written by fate, a script that even the gods themselves seem reluctant to edit. This creates a profound sense of powerlessness. But what about the great heroes? The shining figures like Perseus, Theseus, and Jason Surely. These men of legendary strength and courage, often born from the union of a god and a mortal, were the masters of their own destiny. They slew monsters, founded cities, and defied death. Yet, if you look closely at their stories, you'll find that they weren't masters of the game at all. They were the most powerful and most tragic pieces on the board, instruments crafted by the gods for a specific purpose, used to perform impossible tasks, and, more often than not, discarded once their usefulness had run its course. The very concept of a hero in the Greek sense is different from our modern one. We think of heroes as inspirational figures to be admired. For the Greeks, Ahrs was a figure set apart not just by their incredible abilities, but by their incredible suffering. Their lives were not aspirational, they were cautionary. They were defined by a series of labors, struggles, and tragedies orchestrated by divine will. And no hero embodies this principle more clearly or more tragically than Heracles, the man you might know by his Roman name, Hercules. Heracles' entire life was a direct result of him being used as a tool in a divine squabble. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. This simple fact of his birth earned him the unyielding, lifelong hatred of Zeus's wife, Hera. Heracles' story is not one of a man choosing a heroic path. It is the story of a man trying to survive the relentless persecution of a vengeful goddess. From the very beginning, she tried to destroy him, famously sending 2 venomous snakes to his crib when he was just an infant, a test he survived by strangling them with his bare hands. But Hera's cruelty was just getting started. Her masterstroke of vengeance came when Heracles was a grown man, a happy husband and father. She afflicted him with a sudden, horrifying madness, and in this state, he murdered his own wife, Megara, and his children, believing they were enemies. When the madness lifted and he saw what he had done, he was overcome with a grief so profound he was ready to end his own life. It was at this low point that the famous 12 labors were assigned to him. It's crucial to understand that these were not adventures he sought out. They were a penance, a purification for the murders Hera had forced him to commit. He was ordered by the oracle at Delphi to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus, a man he knew was his inferior. For 12 years, he was a slave to this king, performing a series of seemingly impossible tasks designed to kill him, slaying the Nemean lion, cleaning the Augean stables, capturing Cerberus from the depths of the underworld itself. He was, in essence, Hera's pawn, sent on a decade-long suicide mission. He succeeded only because his divine parentage gave him the strength to endure. He was a blunt instrument, wielded by the gods to solve monstrous problems on Earth. Even a lesser-known hero like Bellerophon fits this pattern perfectly. Bellerophon was the hero who famously tamed the winged horse Pegasus. He was tasked by a king with killing the monstrous chimera, fire-breathing blend of a lion, a goat, and a serpent. He succeeded, becoming a great hero, but his success went to his head. In a moment of classic hubris, he decided that his deeds made him worthy of a place with the gods and tried to fly Pegasus up to the summit of Mount Olympus. Zeus, annoyed by this mortal's presumption, did not meet him for a grand battle. He simply sent a tiny gadfly to sting Pegasus. The horse bucked, and Bellerophon, the great hero, was thrown from its back. He fell all the way to earth, but he did not die. He was crippled and blinded, doomed to wander the world alone. A pathetic, broken man, hated by the gods he had tried to join. He was a useful tool for killing monsters, but the moment he sought a reward for his service, he was swatted from the sky and discarded. Classicists still argue whether the real-world hero cults that sprang up across Greece were dedicated to these figures as role models, or as dangerous ghosts that needed to be appeased. While we might see Heracles as an aspirational figure of strength, many Greek hero cults were centered on the hero's tomb. The belief was that these figures, who lived lives of such violence and tragedy, left behind a powerful, volatile spiritual energy in the place where they were buried. The cult was not necessarily about admiration. It was about managing that dangerous power, appeasing the hero's angry spirit to ensure they would protect the city rather than haunt it. They were worshipped not for their moral goodness, but for their raw, lingering power, a power born from a life of suffering. So, being a hero was not a path to a happy life. It was a sentence. You were a divine hammer, used to smash whatever problem the gods needed solved. You were celebrated for your strength, but that strength was a leash that tied you to their will. You would fight their battles, kill their monsters, and endure endless suffering for their schemes. And once your tasks were done, what was your reward? For many, it was a painful, tragic death. For Heracles, it was finally being brought to Olympus, to live among the gods. But even this feels less like a reward, and more like his final decommissioning. The tool being put back in the celestial toolbox. This ultimate lack of agency, this realization that even the strongest among you are just puppets, paints a bleak picture of mortal existence. And it leads us to the final, unavoidable question. If this is life, what is death? What, if any, justice or peace awaits the average soul in the dreary landscape of the underworld? After a life of navigating divine egos, dodging cursed gifts, running from inescapable prophecies, and being used as a pawn in the games of heroes and gods, a mortal might understandably look forward to death. In many belief systems, death is a release, a final judgment where accounts are settled, and the good are rewarded, while the wicked are punished. It is the ultimate appeal to a higher court. But for the ancient Greeks, there was no such comfort. The final and perhaps greatest hardship of being a mortal was that even after a lifetime of suffering, the afterlife was, for almost everyone, just plain awful. To understand why, you have to erase modern concepts of a binary heaven and hell. The Greek underworld, the kingdom of the god Hades, was not primarily a place of moral retribution. It was simply the place where the dead went. The journey itself was the first sign that this was not a joyous transition. The soul, a fluttering, witless shade, would be led by the messenger god Hermes to the banks of the river Styx, the great, gloomy river that separated the world of the living from the dead. There, you would meet Charon, the grim, spectral ferryman. To cross, you had to pay a fare, a single coin, an obolus, which your living relatives were supposed to have placed in your mouth before burial. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a practical necessity. If your family failed in this duty, your soul was doomed to wander the misty banks of the Styx for 100 years, unable to cross, trapped between two worlds. The first step into eternity was a transaction, and you'd better hope your family paid up. Once across, you would face Cerberus, the monstrous three-headed hound who guarded the gates of Hades. His job wasn't just to keep the living from entering, but more importantly, to keep the dead from leaving. After that, your soul would be judged by three demigod kings Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Eocaspart. This judgment was less about your goodness or sinfulness and more of a sorting process, assigning you to one of three main realms. First, there was Tartarus. This was the closest equivalent to hell. It was a deep, dark pit, a cosmic dungeon where the greatest sinners and those who had directly challenged the gods were sent for eternal torment. This was the VIP lounge of suffering. Here you'd find Sisyphus, forever rolling his boulder, Tantalus, forever unable to eat or drink, and Ixion, bound to a perpetually spinning wheel of fire. But Tartarus was exclusive. You had to commit a truly epic, hubristic crime to get in. It was not the destination for the average sinner. On the opposite end of the spectrum were the Elysian Fields, or Elysium. This was paradise, a beautiful, sunlit meadow where the greatest heroes and those with divine blood in their veins enjoyed a pleasant, peaceful eternity. There was no suffering, no toil. It was an eternity of rest and gentle pursuits. But like Tartarus, Elysium was also an exclusive club. You couldn't get in just by being a good person. You had to be a hero, related to the gods, or a special favorite. For the vast, overwhelming majority of humanity, the 99%, neither of these destinations applied. The destination for almost everyone else, the good, the decent, the not, the farmers, the merchants, the soldiers, the mothers, the children, was the Asphodel Meadows. And it was here that the true, soul-crushing bleakness of the Greek afterlife revealed itself. The asphodel meadows were not a place of torment, but a place of profound, endless, grey nothingness. It was a vast, dim field planted with strange, grey, ghostly, asphodel flowers. Here, the souls, now cold shades, drifted aimlessly for eternity. They were not themselves anymore. A key, quirky detail of the underworld is that it contained not just the river Styx, but for other rivers, including the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. It was believed that the shades of the dead drank from the Lethe, and its waters wiped their minds clean. They lost their memories, their personalities, their ambitions, their loves, their hates. They were hollowed-out echoes of their former selves, gibbering and fluttering like bats in a cave, with no real consciousness or purpose. Achilles himself, when Odysseus visits him in the underworld in the Odyssey, famously says he would rather be a poor, landless serf on earth than be the king of all the dead. Classicists still argue whether this overwhelmingly bleak view of the afterlife was a source of profound despair for the Greeks, or if it served a different social function. One interpretation is that it created a kind of existential urgency, a live-for-today mentality. If you believe that death is a descent into a witless, grey oblivion, then the only time for joy, pleasure, and meaning is right now, in the sunlit world of the living. It places an immense value on mortal life, precisely because it is so fleeting and is followed by nothing. The alternative view is that it reinforced the supreme importance of kleos, or glory and fame. If your consciousness does not survive death, in any meaningful way, the only true immortality you can achieve is to have your name and your deeds remembered on earth. This is why heroes were so obsessed with glory. It was the only thing that could outlast the grave and the waters of the river Lethe. So, after a life of being a divine plaything, your final reward was to have your identity erased and to be filed away in a silent, grey, eternal bureaucracy. Your struggles meant nothing. Your triumphs were forgotten. Your love was erased. It is the ultimate anticlimax, the final cosmic injustice in a long list of them. There was no karmic balance, no final reward for your endurance. There was only the slow, quiet fizzle into an eternity of forgetting. We have journeyed through a veritable landscape of mortal suffering. We've seen how divine desire could turn you into a cow, how pride in your own skill could get you transformed into a spider, and how one unlucky step could lead to you being torn apart by your own dogs. We've learned that a god's gift is often a curse in disguise, that prophecy is an inescapable trap, that even the greatest heroes are disposable tools, and that the reward for enduring all of this is to have your memory wiped clean in a dreary, grey eternity. It is, by any measure, an astonishingly bleak worldview, and it begs the central question, why? Why would a culture create a mythology so consistently hostile to its human characters? What is the purpose of these endless stories of suffering? This is a question that has echoed through the ages, and classicists still argue whether these myths should be read as complex allegories about the natural world, or as stark reflections of real-world social and political anxieties. There is no simple answer, and the truth likely lies in a fusion of both. But exploring the debate gives us the clearest insight into why it truly sucks to be a mortal in Greek mythology. One school of thought, the allegorical interpretation, posits that the gods and their attendant myths are not meant to be understood as literal history, but as a vast, elaborate system for explaining the chaotic and often terrifying world in which the ancient Greeks lived. In this view, the gods are personifications of forces far beyond human control. The unpredictable violence of the sea, the terror of an earthquake, that is the rage of Poseidon, the scorching heat of a summer drought, or the sudden outbreak of a deadly plague that is the wrath of Apollo, firing his invisible arrows into a city. The grief of a mother who loses a child, so profound it feels like the world should stop turning, is given cosmic weight in the story of Demeter, whose sorrow for her daughter Persephone brings winter to the world. From this perspective, the suffering of mortals in the myths is a way of giving a narrative and a face to the random, impersonal hardships of life. A crop failure isn't just a meteorological event. It's a sign that a local nymph has been offended. A sudden, debilitating madness isn't just a psychological break. It's the touch of Dionysus or a curse from Hera. By turning chaos into a story, you make it comprehensible. It suggests that the universe, while dangerous, operates on a system of cause and effect. It may be a terrible system where the punishment rarely fits the crime, but it's still a system, and a system can, perhaps, be navigated or appeased through the correct rituals, sacrifices, and behaviors. It's a way of imposing order on a fundamentally disordered existence. The other major school of thought argues that these myths are less about the natural world and far more about the human one. This view suggests that the volatile, unjust, and tyrannical behavior of the Olympian gods is a direct reflection of the volatile, unjust, and tyrannical behavior of the human rulers, the Bronze Age kings, the warlords, the aristocrats who held power in the real world. The relationship between gods and mortals in myth becomes a direct mirror of the relationship between the powerful and the powerless in society. Think of it this way: the casual cruelty of a god who destroys a mortal for a minor slight perfectly mirrors the absolute power of a king who could execute a peasant for looking at him the wrong way. The stories of hubris, like Arachne's, become powerful tools for social control, warnings against challenging the established hierarchy. The tales of collateral damage, where a whole city suffers for the sins of its king, reinforce the need for collective obedience to authority. The use of heroes as disposable tools reflects the way common soldiers are used as cannon fodder in the wars of the powerful. In this reading, mythology is a form of political and social commentary, a grimly realistic depiction of life in a world without human rights, due process, or any real justice for the common person. A fascinating and very ancient theory that touches on this is known as euhemerism, named after its founder, the Greek writer who lived around 300 BC. He proposed that the gods were not supernatural beings at all, but were originally great mortal kings, queens, and heroes from the distant past. Their great deeds were, over centuries of retelling, exaggerated and embellished, until these historical figures were transformed into full-fledged deities. This quirky, ancient theory provides a bridge between the two ideas. The gods behave like selfish, powerful humans because, at their core, that's what they once were. Ultimately, it's not an either-or question. The enduring power of these myths comes from their ability to operate on all these levels at once. The character of Zeus embodies both the terrifying, unpredictable power of a lightning storm nature and the predatory, unaccountable power of a king society. The stories gave the Greeks a shared language to talk about the most difficult aspects of their lives, from the fear of death to the fear of tyranny. They created a shared understanding that life was a struggle against forces far greater than oneself. And while this might seem pessimistic, it also fostered a sense of communal endurance. In a world governed by such forces, all you really had were your fellow mortals, all of you weathering the same cosmic storm together. And that brings us to the final, unsettling truth of this entire worldview. For the mortal, there was no court of final appeal, no cosmic arbiter of fairness. There was only the chaos of the gods and the cold indifference of fate. We end our journey where we began, on a cosmic chessboard, looking at the precarious state of the mortal pawn. We have traveled through story after story, each one a different shade of suffering, and we have seen the brutal, chaotic, and deeply unfair rules of the game. Now, standing at the end of it all, we can see the final, unsettling truth that underpins this entire mythological worldview. There was no divine court of appeals. There was no celestial ombudsman, no cosmic charter of rights. For a mortal, the universe had no true system of justice. The very idea of justice was twisted into unrecognizable shapes by the gods' whims. The justice for being desired by Zeus was to be turned into a cow and tormented by a gadfly, as Io was. The justice for being a uniquely gifted artist, like Arachne, was not a prize, but a monstrous transformation. The justice for an accidental mistake, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, like Actaeon, was not a warning, but a gruesome death delivered by the creatures you loved most. The gods operated with the absolute impunity of beings who knew they would never ever face consequences for their actions. When they did deign to administer what they called justice, it was rarely proportional or personal. It was collective and catastrophic. The children of Niobe were not guilty of their mother's hubris, yet they paid for it with their lives. The sisters of Semele were not guilty of her affair with Zeus, yet their families were driven to madness and self-destruction in a multi-generational storm of Hera's rage. Divine justice was a wildfire, and if you were standing anywhere near the person who lit the match, you were destined to be burned. Even the concept of a benevolent god, a protector of mankind, is hard to find. The great heroes, who should have been the champions of humanity, were themselves just instruments. As we saw with Heracles, his life was one of endless, imposed suffering, a penance for a crime he was forced to commit by the very gods he served. He was not a symbol of hope, but a symbol of divine exploitation. And if the gods decided to give you a gift, it was often a Trojan horse, a blessing like Midas's gold, or Tithonus's eternal life, that contained the seeds of your utter ruin. In this chaotic system, it's interesting to note that the one god who is often painted as the villain was arguably the most stable and fair ruler. Hades, lord of the underworld, was grim and unyielding, but he was also a dutiful administrator. His realm ran on a set of predictable rules. He rarely left it, and he rarely meddled in the affairs of the living or the squabbles of Olympus. His great crime was the abduction of Persephone, but compared to the daily list of outrages committed by his brother Zeus, Hades's record is remarkably clean. The injustice for mortals came not from the darkness below, but from the dazzling chaotic light of Olympus above. The Greeks even had a goddess, Themis, who was the literal personification of divine law and order, but she was a titan, a remnant of an older, more orderly time. And while Zeus took her as a consort, he and his fellow Olympians seemed to treat her counsel as little more than a gentle suggestion, one they were free to ignore whenever it suited them. So, why create such a world? As we explored, these myths may have been allegories for nature and reflections of society, but in the end, perhaps their most important function was to build resilience, by imagining a universe that is fundamentally unfair, where the powers that be are capricious and self-absorbed. You are steeled against the real-world injustices you will inevitably face. These stories do not teach you to expect fairness, they teach you how to endure its absence. They suggest that courage, dignity, and honor are not things you practice in the hopes of a reward, but things you practice for their own sake, because they are all you can truly control in a world that is spinning wildly out of control. It's a bleak lesson, but it is also one of profound strength. It is the cold comfort of knowing that you are not alone in your struggle, that you are part of a long shared human history of enduring the storm, whether it's sent by a god, by a king, or by nature itself. And so, our long journey through this perilous world, this place of profound and constant anxiety, finally comes to a quiet close. The quarrels on Mount Olympus are silent now, their echoes fading into the distance of a long ago time. The demands of inescapable fate are only whispers in a story that has been told, a book that we can now gently close. Let the weight of these old sorrows, the fears of gods and monsters, of curses and tragic ends, drift away from you now, like mist rising from a river in the morning. They are not your burdens to carry. Feel the quiet comfort of your own bed, the gentle pressure of the blankets, the steady and reassuring rhythm of your own breathing. The world of myth, with all its beautiful terrors, is a place we can visit, and a place we can safely leave behind. Let the darkness of your room be a soft and welcoming sanctuary, a quiet space free from the gaze of any god. Let your own thoughts slow down, becoming as soft and indistinct as the shades in the asphodel meadows, but leading not to a grey eternity, but to a peaceful, restorative sleep. Take a final, slow, deep breath, and let go.